It is the spring of 1985. In Moscow, a general with 25 years of service to the Soviet military wakes up before dawn. He has done this every morning for a decade. Risen in the dark, driven to work, and handed American intelligence officers the most valuable secrets the Cold War has ever produced. His name is Dmitry Polyakov, and for 10 years, the CIA has called him their greatest asset. 4,000 miles away, a man walks into an upscale Georgetown restaurant carrying a plastic shopping bag. Inside the bag are 7 pounds of classified CIA cables, the names and real identities of every Soviet intelligence officer secretly working for the United States. He sits down across from a Soviet embassy official. He slides the bag under the table. And just like that, over a glass of vodka and a handshake, the most devastating betrayal in CIA history begins. The men named in those cables had families, careers, children who would never see them again. Within months, they would begin to vanish, dragged from their offices, thrown into cells, and executed with a single round to the back of the head. But the man with the shopping bag was not some shadowy foreign operative. He was a 31-year veteran of the Central Intelligence Agency, and his job, the very role the agency had entrusted to him, was to catch Soviet spies. His name was Aldrich Ames, and for 9 years, nobody stopped him. To understand how one man could dismantle American intelligence from the inside, you first need to understand what the CIA had built and what it stood to lose. By the early 1980s, the agency was running what insiders described as a golden age of human intelligence. Deep inside the Soviet military and intelligence apparatus, a network of courageous men had chosen, at enormous personal risk, to pass secrets to Washington. General Dmitry Polyakov, the man from our opening, was perhaps the most valuable of them all. A senior officer in Soviet military intelligence, Polyakov had been feeding the CIA critical information for nearly 2 decades. Data on Soviet weapons systems, military doctrine, and the identities of foreign agents. According to former CIA Director James Woolsey, Polyakov was worth more to the United States than all the technical intelligence collected during the Cold War combined. The FBI called him the most important spy the United States had ever recruited. Then there was Adolf Tolkachev, an unassuming Soviet defense researcher who walked into the American embassy in Moscow and offered something extraordinary: the technical specifications of Soviet radar and avionics systems. The intelligence he provided was so valuable that analysts estimated it saved the Pentagon billions in research and development. He became known in classified circles as the billion-dollar spy. These were not ideological fanatics. They were men who had looked at the system they served and decided, quietly and deliberately, that they could no longer be part of it. Their courage kept the balance of power from tipping during the most dangerous decades of the Cold War. But the agency had a problem it refused to see. The very division responsible for protecting these sources, the Soviet counterintelligence branch, was about to be handed to a man who would sell every one of them to Moscow. And the CIA had been warned. Multiple times. Aldrich Ames was born into the intelligence world. His father, Carlton Ames, worked for the CIA as an analyst, though by most accounts, the elder Ames was a heavy drinker whose career plateaued early. At 16, Aldrich followed his father into the agency, starting as a summer clerk. By the time he formally joined in 1962, espionage was already the family business. But Ames was never the operative the agency wanted him to be. Performance reviews described him as merely satisfactory. Supervisors noted his indifferent attitude, his tendency to cut corners, his chronic lateness. He drank, not socially, but heavily, and often at work. In one posting, he was found passed out after a diplomatic function. In another, he left a briefcase containing classified documents on a commuter train. And yet he kept getting promoted. The agency transferred him rather than disciplined him, moved him sideways rather than out. It was the quiet machinery of institutional inertia, the same machinery that would later allow him to operate undetected for nearly a decade. Consider this. Ames was required to take polygraph examinations as a condition of his security clearance. He took them. He passed. Twice, despite actively spying for the KGB. The question of how he beat those tests is one that investigators would wrestle with for years. In 1981, Ames was posted to Mexico City. There, two things happened that would set the betrayal in motion. First, he met Maria del Rosario Casas Dupuy, a Colombian cultural attaché with expensive tastes and, according to those who knew them, an appetite for a lifestyle that a mid-career CIA salary could never support. Ames was smitten. He left his first wife, herself a CIA employee, and began a relationship that would accelerate his financial ruin. Second, and more critically, his work in Mexico City gave him direct access to Soviet intelligence officers, the very people he was supposed to recruit. Instead, he was learning their world from the inside, studying how they operated, understanding what they valued. By 1985, Ames was drowning. His divorce was expensive. Rosario's spending was relentless. He owed $50,000 and saw no way out. But here is where the story diverges from a simple tale of greed. Because the evidence reveals something more complicated than a man who simply wanted money. On the surface, yes. Ames told himself he needed cash. He rationalized the first approach as a one-time transaction. $50,000 to pass along the names of a few CIA sources he believed the Soviets already knew about. Beneath that, resentment. 23 years of mediocre reviews, passed over for promotions, watching less talented colleagues advance while he stagnated. In prison interviews documented by journalist Pete Early, Ames described the CIA as a self-serving institution run by careerist bureaucrats who cared more about their pensions than national security. Deeper still, psychologists who studied the case described Ames as grandiose and impulsive. A man who believed he was smarter than the system that employed him. He did not see himself as a traitor. He saw himself as the only honest man in a dishonest institution. And finally, the context that comment sections across the internet still argue about to this day: the CIA itself. A bureaucracy so committed to protecting its own image that it ignored every warning sign Ames presented. The drinking, the spending, the failed polygraph flags that examiners waved away because, after all, Ames was one of their own. On April 16, 1985, Ames walked into the Soviet embassy in Washington and handed over the names of 2 CIA assets, receiving $50,000 in return. He told himself it was a one-time event. It was not. 2 months later, at Chadwick's restaurant in Georgetown, he crossed the point of no return. 7 pounds of classified cables, every active CIA source inside the Soviet Union, handed over in a shopping bag. What happened next was not gradual. It was a massacre. General Polyakov, top hat, the man the FBI had called the most important spy in American history, arrested, interrogated, and executed with a single bullet to the back of the head. His family was not told why. They were simply informed, after the fact, that he had been executed as a traitor. Adolf Tolkachev, the billion-dollar spy, seized at his Moscow apartment. According to CIA accounts, when his captors allowed him to write a confession, he requested his own pen, a pen the agency had outfitted with a concealed cyanide capsule. He bit down on it. He was gone before he hit the floor. Inside the CIA, a quiet devastation rippled through the Soviet division. Sources were going dark, operations were collapsing, and two women, working in near isolation on the 4th floor of Langley, had already begun to suspect the unthinkable. Sandy Grimes had known several of the executed agents personally. She had handled their cases, read their reports, understood what they had sacrificed. When they started dying, she took it personally, because it was personal. Together with Jean Vertefeuille, Grimes began the painstaking work of building a timeline. When had each source been compromised? Who had access to their identities? Where did the patterns converge? The answer kept pointing to the same place, but the bureaucracy above them did not want to hear it. According to Grimes' own account, senior officials demanded more and more proof. They insisted the team eliminate 100 other possible suspects before they would consider the obvious one. Whether it was institutional cowardice or something worse, the result was the same. Years of delay while more people died. Meanwhile, Aldrich Ames was not exactly hiding. He bought a $540,000 home in Arlington, Virginia, in cash. He drove a Jaguar to work. He paid $6,500 a month for phone calls to Rosario's family in Colombia. His credit card bills routinely exceeded his monthly salary. When colleagues asked about the money, Ames had an answer ready. Rosario's family was wealthy, and astonishingly, no one checked. The institution that prided itself on uncovering secrets around the globe could not, or would not, look at the man sitting 2 offices down the hall. And the polygraph? In 1991, Ames was called in for his routine examination. The machine flagged deception on questions about unauthorized contacts with foreign nationals. The examiner noted the anomaly. But after a follow-up session in which Ames appeared calmer, the results were reclassified as inconclusive, and the matter was dropped. He had beaten the machine, not through tradecraft, but because the examiner chose to believe him. By 1993, the evidence Grimes and Vertefeuille had assembled was overwhelming. The FBI was finally brought in. Agents began surveilling Ames, tapping his phone, searching his trash, tracking his movements. What they found confirmed the worst. Ames was still active, still meeting his handlers, still passing classified material. They watched him make a chalk mark on a mailbox post on Garfield Street, the signal to his KGB handlers that a dead drop was ready. They watched a Soviet officer wipe it off. 3 days before the arrest, Ames was observed loading documents into his car. The night before, FBI agents entered his home and copied the hard drive of his personal computer, finding a trove of correspondence with his KGB handlers, including detailed payment records. He had kept records of everything. That morning, February 21st, 1994, FBI agents boxed in his Jaguar on a quiet Arlington street. He turned the key. The Jaguar eased onto the street. 2 unmarked sedans pulled in front. A third blocked the rear. Aldrich Ames looked up at the men surrounding his car, and according to the agents who were there, he did not look surprised. He was charged with conspiracy to commit espionage. The damage assessment took months to compile. When it was finished, the Senate Intelligence Committee called it the most devastating espionage case in American history. More than 100 intelligence operations had been compromised. At least 10 courageous men who had trusted the United States with their lives had been sent to their deaths. Billions of dollars in intelligence collection. Gone. And Ames himself? In a jailhouse interview that would come to define his legacy, he showed no remorse for the men he had condemned. He told journalist Pete Early, with the flatness of a man discussing paperwork, that he knew perfectly well what he was doing. He pled guilty on April 28, 1994, and was sentenced to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Rosario, who had helped conceal his activities and laundered portions of the payments, received a 63-month sentence. She was eventually deported to Colombia. Dmitry Polyakov, Gennady Smetanin, Valery Martinov, Sergei Motorin, Boris Yuzhin, who survived imprisonment only because Ames had misremembered his name. Men with families. Men with decades of service. Men who had chosen to work against a system they believed was wrong, and who had trusted that the people receiving their information would protect them. They were not protected. Sandy Grimes and Jean Vertefoy, the two women whose persistence had finally brought Ames down, were awarded the Career Intelligence Medal, the CIA's highest internal honor. They later wrote a book called Circle of Treason. In it, they described the years of institutional resistance they faced, the demands for more evidence, the reluctance of senior officials to confront the possibility that one of their own had turned. Grimes has said in interviews that she still thinks about the assets who died, that the awards, however meaningful, do not change what happened. They had been right from the beginning. It had taken the system nearly a decade to listen. We began this file with a general rising before dawn. A man with 25 years of service. A man who had, for a decade, walked into danger every single morning on the premise that the people receiving his intelligence would guard it with the same care he was risking his life to provide. That premise was wrong. On January 5, 2026, Aldrich Ames died in federal prison at the age of 83. He had spent 32 years behind bars. None of the men he betrayed served any years at all. Because the uncomfortable truth is this: Ames did not succeed because he was brilliant. He was not. Every investigator who studied the case said the same thing. He was sloppy, arrogant, and reckless. But the CIA built the room he worked in. The CIA gave him the list. The CIA looked at the Jaguar and the expensive suits and the cash deposits and decided, year after year, that none of it required investigation. The institution promoted a man with a documented alcohol problem, mounting debt, and mediocre performance reviews into the most sensitive counterintelligence position in the United States government. And then, when assets began disappearing at a rate that had no precedent in CIA history, it took 9 years to look at the man with the Jaguar and the $500,000 house. 10 men were executed. 1 man sold them. But the institution that was supposed to protect them, that had promised to protect them, failed every single one of them for 9 consecutive years. The betrayal did not come from one man alone. It came from every person who could have asked a question and chose not to. Was Aldrich Ames the CIA's worst traitor? Or was he the symptom of something the CIA has never fully admitted? The file on Aldrich Ames is closed, but the question it leaves behind is still open. And if you think one traitor inside the CIA was devastating, the FBI had its own. His name was Robert Hansen, and some investigators believe he did even more damage. That file opens next.